Ever since his abdication, Edward VIII has been portrayed as a royal who failed to do his duty. A king who gave up the throne for love. A pro-Nazi that Britain was lucky to be rid of in the dangerous years that followed. But there is another story.
We look back on it as an abdication. But of course it was more than that. I mean, he was really deposed.
70 years ago, King Edward VIII was pushed off the throne. It was a coup engineered by a powerful conspiracy of court, church, and government. They loathed his informal style, his dislike of royal traditions, and they feared his appeal to ordinary people.
We felt that there were machinations in higher levels of government and society that had really pushed Edward out, not the will of the people.
And when Edward fell in love with an unsuitable woman, they had the perfect excuse.
The fact that Edward wanted to marry Wallis Simpson was perceived by many members of the establishment as a godsend.
It was a crisis of only 45 days in which the British state, with brutal efficiency, removed a troublesome king.
It was the biggest event to affect the throne since Cromwell.
London is hushed as the King of England walks behind his dead father, and the world takes leave of the man who was the symbol of all the might, majesty and power of the British Commonwealth of Nations.
On a cold winter's day in January 1936, the body of King George V was taken from Westminster to be buried at Windsor. The mind of the 41-year-old King Edward VIII, as he followed the coffin, was in turmoil. He was madly in love. He hated the stuffy pomp and tradition of the old court, and he wanted change.
And at last the journey is over, and the coffin is borne into St. George's Chapel, the place which of all others is most appropriate to the ideals King George represented in life.
The old king, George V, had reigned for 25 years in stultifying boredom, collecting stamps and massacring pheasants. He was loved by his courtiers and government for his devotion to the unchanging traditions and duties of royalty. He never stepped out of line. Edward was different. The corpse of his father was barely cold when he ordered the clocks at Sandringham to revert to Greenwich Mean Time. King George had kept them half an hour fast to save daylight for his beloved shooting. The old court was horrified. To them it was a symbolic act, a sign of potential revolution. The Archbishop of Canterbury lamented,
"I wonder what other customs will be put back also."
We can see Edward, I think, as very much exemplifying a spirit of the generation. He loved jazz. And he liked to wear American clothes. He didn't like to dress up with the same kind of formality. He flew. He was the first royal to fly. And he was so interested in new things that were happening. People saw Edward very much in that way, as exemplifying this new era.
As Prince of Wales, Edward had forged a tremendous bond with the ordinary people of Britain and the Empire. During the First War, he visited the trenches and came face to face with the suffering of the common soldier, an experience he never forgot. In the Great Depression, he identified with the poverty of veterans and the mass unemployed. With nearly a quarter of the population out of work, many in the national government feared civil unrest, but Edward spoke directly to the people.
We felt that he was a modernizer, and we felt that he had a contact with the people. We believed in him. I think that is the best way to put it. We really did believe in him.
On his many exhausting tours of the Empire, the Prince of Wales' matinee idol looks and his easy charm meant a star was born on the world stage.
You couldn't be cuter, plus that you couldn't be smarter, plus that intelligent face, you have a disgraceful charm for me.
He shook so many hands he injured his right and often had to use his left.
You are the little grand...
He was the joy of all hearts. It must have been very difficult to avoid being spoiled by this adulation that he got everywhere, you see, particularly from girls.
Couldn't be nicer, couldn't be better, couldn't be cuter, baby, than you are.
I have been terrifyingly struck, again and again, by the resemblance between King Edward VIII and the late Princess of Wales. It became clear what an astonishing capacity he had to communicate, to strike a note, not just with individuals, but with a crowd. He had a dazzling, charismatic appeal, and all this made him a pop star of quite extraordinary dimensions.
Exactly.
Like Diana, part of his charm seemed to stem from a personal unhappiness. What once was described as a look of Weltschmerz, world weariness, always in his eyes. This was partly the result of deep strains in his relationship with his father.
What to the Prince of Wales seemed agreeable informality, an attempt slightly to sort of humanize the monarchy, to King George V seemed most monstrous, almost treasonable behaviour. He was not merely angered, he was alarmed. He felt that this was something calculated in the end to rot the very foundations of the monarchy, the institution which he so cherished and valued.
Over the years, the old king had become more distant from the Prince of Wales, known to his family as David, and ever closer to his more conventional and dutiful second son, Albert, the Duke of York.
You have always been so sensible and easy to work with, and you have always been so ready to listen to any advice and to agree with my opinions about people and things. Very different to dear David.
It was a preference for the deeply conservative younger brother that came to be shared by a much wider group by the time Edward VIII was king. In this era of political instability, many members of the government feared Edward's mass appeal and apparent disregard for the established order. The Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, wrote that he was alarmed by
the delicate situation created by the personality of the new king.
Neville Chamberlain, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, agreed.
I do hope he pulls up his socks and behaves himself now he has such heavy responsibilities. For unless he does, he will soon pull down the throne.
At St. James's Palace, the Garter King of Arms reads the proclamation.
Whereas it hath pleased Almighty God...
The king's strained relationship with the politicians was kept well hidden from the public. At its heart was a secret that would be his downfall.
That the high and mighty Prince Edward Albert, by the grace of God...
As the new monarch was proclaimed, a woman could be seen watching, with the king, from a window in St. James's Palace.
King, Defender of the Faith, Emperor of India.
She was Wallis Simpson, a 40-year-old American. This footage of the king with his lover was so sensitive that it was never shown to the public.
God save the king.
The king's relationship with Mrs. Simpson was nearly 5 years old when he came to the throne.
What I think is extraordinary is that in the 1930s, it was actually possible for the small group of upper-class people known as society to know everything going on in royal circles and to know about Wallis, for example, and yet nearly everybody else knew nothing about her.
Those in the know were all too aware that Wallis was already once divorced and currently married to Ernest Simpson, a New York shipbroker. To the old guard, she was totally unsuitable.
Wallis was not an aristocratic woman. She came from the wrong side of the tracks. She had grown up in Baltimore in a life of relative poverty. She knew what struggle was. And when she came to Britain and became acquainted with royal circles, she never pretended that she came from a different background.
She treated the Prince of Wales with a indifference, with a casualness, almost a contempt, which was something he had never encountered before, and which he found exciting and stimulating and enormously attractive.
Now I've found the right girl, oh what a girl, oh what a future, I'm in a well.
If she disagreed with me, she never failed to advance her own views with vigor and spirit. That side of her enchanted me.
My search is ended, bye-bye the past.
She was quite managerial. I mean, she bossed him about. She had no hesitation in telling him what she thought he ought to do and what she wanted him to do. And he very seldom, that I can remember, kicked against the pricks.
I've found the right girl, she's turned up at last.
He was just besottedly in love for the first time in his life. I mean, he'd been in love before, but not like this. This was something different.
It was different for Wallis, too.
I only hope that I can make you feel I am always loving you, working for you and with you. I am your Wallis.
The King's affair with Wallis Simpson took place in the London salons and the country house parties of the fashionable set. This hedonistic lifestyle, so scandalous to the older generation, was in part a reaction to the dark days of World War I.
They did behave badly. They did take drugs. They did drink too much. They did fornicate. But all this, in a sense, was an expression of relief, grief, and other human emotions after what had been a really terrible war.
In 1936, war was looming again, but the royal love affair was all that those in the know could talk of. Henry Chips Channon was a champion of Edward and Wallis, an American-born millionaire and a brilliant diarist of the crisis.
She is a woman of charm, sense, balance, and great wit, with dignity and taste. She's always been an excellent influence on the king, who's loved her openly and honestly.
MP Harold Nicholson was also a gifted diarist whose writings give a brilliant and more detached insight into the gathering storm.
Mrs. Simpson is bejeweled, eyebrow-plucked, virtuous, and wise. She is clearly out to help him.
Duff Cooper, Minister for War, was a friend of the King and Mrs. Simpson, and another diarist with an unrivaled view of events.
My father, he was a curious figure in many ways, because, I mean, he was a very ambitious politician. But at the same time, he was very much a sort of man about town. He was known for his love of pleasure, his love of drink, his love of women. The King probably saw that side of him and thought that my father, more than any other member of the cabinet, was possibly going to be on his side, or at least he might be convertible to his side.
While the establishment railed in private against the new king and Wallis Simpson, Edward was as popular as ever with his subjects.
Many happy returns of the day to His Majesty King Edward VIII on his 42nd birthday is the thought uppermost in the hearts of thousands crowding around Buckingham Palace, and echoed in the hearts of millions of others all over the world as the King rides down the Mall to the Horse Guards for the birthday parade.
What Edward VIII hated most about what he always referred to as princing, appearing in public, playing the role, was the pomposity and the formality. That was what really almost broke his nerve. When he was actually breaking through, when he was in direct communication with people, he became enthused, he became excited, he enjoyed it.
He loathed the fustiness of Buckingham Palace and wanted to cut through the hierarchy of rank and tradition.
He would suddenly appear in the kitchens, the cellars and the storerooms or other behind-the-scenes parts of the palace, walking round alone or with one equerry on tours of inspection. It was all very informal and quite unlike anything we had seen King George V do at the palace.
Buckingham Palace Garden, and out of the palace issue the privileged young ladies who are to be presented today at the first of the receptions which this year are to replace the formal courts.
The king showed his distaste for the old court's traditions during the presentation of debutantes at the beginning of the season. He regarded this as an archaic and snobbish tradition and found it hard to conceal his boredom during the ceremony.
The king bows punctiliously as each debutante makes the curtsy, which will be for her an exciting memory in afterlife.
There was a long line of debutantes waiting to curtsy to him, and it started to rain. So then he said, well, let's just stop this then and regard them all as, having achieved what they've come to do. And of course, everyone was very upset about this. They felt he wasn't doing things properly.
Only 6 months into his reign, and the king's behaviour had confirmed the old court's worst fears. He had offended a deadly coalition of courtiers, politicians and church.
Elderly courtiers and stuffy elderly ministers.
The elderly cohort latched on to Edward's love for Wallis Simpson. This scandalous affair became the focus of a campaign to be rid of him. Such was their suspicion of the monarch that Special Branch was ordered to spy on the couple.
What on earth were they doing, spying on the Prince of Wales and then the King? There's nothing in those records actually to show why, but we do have the reports that were filed.
The conversation showed they were on very affectionate terms and addressed each other as darling. A number of purchases were made and orders given for the goods to be sent to York House and marked Fort Belvedere. The opinion of the dealer expressed after his distinguished client had left was that the lady seemed to have the Prince of Wales completely under her thumb.
It is remarkable that Edward, both as Prince of Wales and then as King, was being trailed by a special branch operative. It's a sign of the degree to which the establishment felt they simply could not trust him. He wasn't one of them.
In the summer of 1936, Wallis and Edward chartered a yacht, the Narlin, to cruise the Mediterranean. The diarist Duff Cooper filmed this remarkable unseen footage.
Take me where the songbirds thrill you with sweet refrains. We'll make hay while the sun shines. We'll make love when it rains.
The Narlin was the time when I saw them at their most relaxed and happiest. There was a lot of swimming. There's no doubt he thoroughly enjoyed himself, and so did she.
Take me where the daisies cover the country lanes. We'll make hay while the sun shines. We'll make love when it rains.
The lovers were cheered as they strolled through the streets of Dubrovnik, where they were greeted not with shouts of "Long live the King," but "Vive l'amour."
Wallis was fun. She had a grasp of the American wisecracking technique. She was very quick. She had a sense of humor, certainly. She was a little bit mischievous. She had a slightly wicked sense of humor.
The holiday was a turning point. It showed that the king was prepared to flaunt his love for the whole world to see, whatever the consequences.
My parents did enjoy it, but at the same time, knowing this Mrs. Simpson thing was hanging over the whole thing, you know, I'm sure they didn't show it, but it must actually have cast a little bit of a cloud over everything. I think my father was desperately worried.
A head-on collision between the king and the establishment was now inevitable. The question was when. The world's press widely reported the open romance during the Narlin cruise. But in an act of unparalleled self-censorship, nothing appeared in British newspapers. While the masses were ignorant, a tiny upper-class minority was agog.
Though nothing about Mrs. Simpson appears in the English papers, her name seems never to be off people's lips. For those who enjoy gossip, she is a particular treat. The sound of her name implies secrecy, royalty, and being in the know.
She regretted that her brother-in-law had taken up with this hard-faced harpy, and her one desire was that Mrs. Simpson should disappear in a puff of smoke and never be heard of again.
Elizabeth and Wallis met for one memorable dinner during their Balmoral holiday.
When they arrived, Mrs. Simpson came forward in a rather proprietorial way to greet them. And the Duchess of York is said to have swept past her, paying no attention. "I've come to dine with the King," she said, brushing this contemptible figure to one side, to the extreme annoyance of Mrs. Simpson.
With this calculated snub, an undying feud was born. The Yorks were now cut off by the King, who mistrusted all around him, including even his key official, the private secretary, Alec Harding.
He was a man who shared entirely the views of King George V about how monarchs ought to behave, what they ought to do. And the last thing that King Edward VIII wanted around his court was a man who stood for all the values of his father and his father's court.
Alec Harding now visited the Duke of York behind Edward's back to warn him the situation was so grave it could end with the removal of the King and his taking over. After the meeting, the Duke wrote that he would be a willing substitute.
If the worst happens and I have to take over, you can be assured that I will do my best to clear up the inevitable mess, if the whole fabric does not crumble under the shock and strain of it all.
5 days later, an obscure legal notice ignited the crisis. Wallis Simpson filed for divorce from her husband, Ernest, opening the way for her to marry the King, and if nothing was done, to become the Queen. At Buckingham Palace, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Times editor Dawson met the King's private secretary without Edward's knowledge. Lang was horrified at the prospect of the coronation.
The thought of my having to consecrate him as king weighed on me as a heavy burden. Indeed, I considered whether I could bring myself to do so.
One could say that this was the start of plotting between different members of the establishment to bounce Edward off the throne.
At Ipswich Assizes, to avoid unwanted attention, Wallis Simpson's case was heard and her divorce granted. A brief notice was buried in the press. But in the United States, the American press was going to town on the story.
Yes, yes, my baby said yes, yes. I'm glad she said yes, yes, instead of no, no.
So too was high society in London.
Mrs. Simpson has now obtained her divorce, and there are very serious rumours that the King will make her Duchess of Edinburgh and marry.
In the highest court circles, there is great consternation. It is said that Queen Mary weeps continuously.
Yes, yes, I'm glad she said yes, yes, instead of no, no.
18 years after the last shot was fired and peace mercifully descended upon war-wracked Europe, Britain's Armistice Day tribute is led for the first time by her new King, Edward VIII. The Prime Minister, his cabinet and opposition leaders are among the distinguished persons taking part.
But the watching politicians and dignitaries were just hours away from making the first move to dethrone the King. Edward's private secretary now wrote a letter addressed to the King. Alec Harding warned that his affair was doing untold damage to Britain's image abroad, and that the resignation of the government over Wallis Simpson was a real possibility. Mrs. Simpson, he wrote, must leave the country.
The letter was given by Alec Harding to the King as something that he himself had written. In fact, behind that letter were many meetings involving the Prime Minister, members of the Cabinet, Dawson, editor of the Times, the head of the Civil Service, all coming together to write this letter.
After a day inspecting the home fleet, the king returned to his retreat, Fort Belvedere, to discover the letter. He was appalled at the disloyalty of his private secretary and was immediately suspicious. He later wrote,
"How was I to construe this? A warning? An ultimatum? Who could have told Alec Harding all this but the Prime Minister? What was Mr. Baldwin's purpose? There was little sleep for me that night. It was the crisis of a king."
There is no doubt it was plotting behind the king's back. It was a conspiracy, if you like. He had no idea of the level of involvement from all these different and very powerful interest groups. And so here was the king, one of the most important person in the country, getting a letter from his private secretary that had actually been crafted by all these different men who were at the highest levels of power, and not actually telling Edward what was going on. I mean, really, the thing was a lie. It was a cover-up.
3 days later, the king summoned the Prime Minister to meet him alone at Buckingham Palace. Baldwin told him,
"You may think that I am an old man dating from the Victorian regime, but I do know public opinion in this country. Since the war, there has been a lowering of public standards and of public morals, but people expect even more of the monarchy."
When Stanley Baldwin spoke about public opinion, I think he was speaking about the world of society, where the people who counted were not the masses of the people, but rather the small group of people who had influence and were powerful.
But Edward insisted that he had the right to marry the woman of his choice. If the government opposed him, he would go. The king had played straight into Baldwin's hands. Far from being upset by the threat, Baldwin was delighted, as he told Ramsay MacDonald.
7:30, Met PM, ebullient. He said the king was determined to marry Mrs. S. and was prepared to abdicate. Nice kettle of fish.
The next day, the king met the diarist, Duff Cooper. Edward described how
the Prime Minister had told him that while the country would never accept such a marriage, they would not object so strongly to his having a mistress. That, he thought, was the height of hypocrisy. He said he would not like to go through a solemn ceremony like the coronation without being perfectly frank with the country beforehand. He would not like to be keeping something up his sleeve.
In the evening, the king took the royal train from Paddington for a tour of the impoverished coalfields of South Wales. He later wrote,
"Reflecting on the turmoil that I knew must by this time have gripped Whitehall, I was at peace with myself. My spiritual struggle was over. I had passed the climax."
But as events would prove, the climax was just beginning.
Bringing the whole problem of the repressed areas out of the shadows into the floodlight of world attention, His Majesty's visit to South Wales is not only a promise of new life, but a gesture of sympathy with men and women who for years have borne bravely the misery and sufferings of unemployment, who have had to watch helpless while their homes and their towns fell into ruin and decay.
The King's visit to South Wales was a reminder of the strong bond he had with ordinary people outside the closed world of London society, and the magnetism of his personality.
He was young, dynamic, modernizer, and good-looking. He was a personality. I don't think he sold, it wasn't a package personality as you get nowadays, but it had the same effect as a package personality.
Many thousands cheered the king as he arrived at Merthyr Tydfil in the Rhondda Valley, but the purpose of his tour was deadly serious, not triumphal.
When he visited Merthyr, people lined the streets, but more than that, when he passed, they used to rush then to the next place to see him. It's unbelievable the way it happened. It's similar to pop stars of today who are mobbed, basically. It was as if the Beatles had arrived in the town.
But beneath all this, His Majesty saw the disillusion and suffering wrought by long workless years.
We like you for the concern you have for the welfare of the poorest and most unfortunate of your subjects. No other king has gone among them as you have done.
Of this terribly afflicted area, the town of Dallas is the blackest spot of all. Not a single workman has toiled in its steelworks, which employed 9,000 since 1928.
More than 2,000 people were waiting for him at Dallas. The king was profoundly moved by what he saw.
And what he said was, these works brought these men here. Something must be done to get them back to work. And it was the something must be done that really echoed almost around the world.
The king left South Wales with the determination that something must be done.
Though he said that only to a small number of people around him at the time, it just spread like a fire right throughout the borough, that everybody knew that this is what he said. And that is when I think that the ray of hope came, I think, that for the future of Merthyr.
South Wales welcomed King Edward as the only man in Britain to whom this distressed area problem is not a matter of vote catching and politics.
But others did not think so. For Edward's enemies, this was an unwarranted intrusion into politics.
It was not simply that Edward said something must be done and appeared in this way to be criticising the government's failure to do anything. It was also the fact that he was so popular and people all over the country really cared what he said and what he thought about. And if he said that something must be done, then clearly something must be done.
His visit has cheered them as nothing else could. And as he leaves, there's a newfound faith that some solution will be found.
Geoffrey Dawson, the Times editor and the King's enemy, wrote in his diary that the King's intervention was monstrous. In a Times leader, he warned against
a constitutionally dangerous proceeding, and would threaten, if continued, to entangle the throne in politics.
Ramsay MacDonald wrote in his diary,
"These escapades should be limited. They are an invasion into the field of politics and should be watched constitutionally."
The King's successful visit was a watershed in the crisis. To his enemies, it confirmed him as a dangerous liability, a man who could rouse the masses in a socialist heartland. But Edward's popularity during the tour convinced him not only that he had every right to remain king and marry his love, but that he should do so for the sake of his country. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill, for years a loyal supporter, became his parliamentary champion.
My father's friendship with Edward VIII went back a long way to before the First World War. My father was a very loyal person, and all his feelings of warmth for the Prince of Wales and then the King were ones of spontaneous loyalty and affection.
Winston Churchill suggested a morganatic marriage as the solution, meaning that Wallis Simpson would marry the king but not be queen. There was uproar at Westminster when MPs learnt of the plan.
A bombshell. Leslie Hoare-Belisha thinks the Conservatives will resign and that Winston Churchill will create a new party and rule the country. I can think of nothing else but the changes and terrors ahead. The country divided, mental civil war going on, and schism in the royal family. The battle for the throne has begun.
But the Prime Minister had got wind of the morganatic plan and was in no mood to bargain. He regarded Churchill as a highly dangerous maverick, a man he could not trust. He summoned him to Downing Street and demanded a pledge that he would not form a King's party.
My father thought Baldwin was pretty determined to have the king out. His role was in the support, the personal support and sympathy he was able to give the king, who he felt was being pushed into a corner.
The next morning, egged on by Churchill, the king had an audience with Baldwin. He proposed a morganatic marriage, refusing point blank to abandon his love. Prime Minister said this was unacceptable, but offered to consult the cabinet and empire. The king agreed. It was a fatal tactical error.
From the time at which he agreed with Baldwin, that Baldwin should consult the Commonwealth governments and generally sort of establish a formal position on the subject, it became inevitable that if that formal position turned out to be contrary to the king's wishes, then he would not be able to go ahead and marry as he wanted, but would have to go.
I'm putting all my eggs in one.
Baldwin moved fast, that weekend sending out telegrams to the leaders of the dominions, asking for the empire's opinion. He added his own view.
I feel convinced that neither Parliament nor the great majority of the public in all parties here should or would accept such a plan of a morganatic marriage, any more than they would accept the proposal that Mrs. Simpson should become queen.
Everything I've got, every single thing I've got, I bet on you.
And bang.
Topic number 1. Bishop Blunt of Bradford made a speech accusing the king of not being worthy of his own coronation service. This leads to a blowing of the whole gaff.
The storm has burst. The fat is now properly in the fire.
Then, as now, royal scandal sold papers.
As I drove round to the station, an issue of the afternoon paper had just appeared, and there was not a man or woman in the street who was not either carrying a copy or trying to buy one.
The newspapers had kept all the pictures ready for months. While the respectable broadsheets were against him, the mass circulation press backed the king and his love.
On the one hand, the Tory press, the Times, the Telegraph and the Morning Post were so powerful, and yet the readership amounted to about 80,000. The other press, the Express newspapers, the Mail newspapers and so on, had a readership of about 9 million. And these were the papers that were read by the majority of the people of Britain at the time. And these newspapers supported Edward.
The general public sent in letters by the thousand. 90% were reckoned to be pro-king. In the first few days alone, more than 5,000 letters poured in.
Please do not abdicate, as we poorer class people will lose a would-be great and loyal king.
If Mrs. Simpson is good enough for His Majesty, we want her. Stick to your guns.
God save us from the long-faced Duke of York, who would, I'm sure, be the best of good boys.
Please, I beg of you, to remain our king. And please remember, there is not one who could fill your place in the hearts of the people.
Meanwhile, Wallis Simpson was close to breaking point. Her home was besieged by journalists, and she had been sent death threats. It was decided that she should flee to France.
I think everyone here would like that, except one, perhaps. After a while, my name will be forgotten, and only two will suffer instead of a mass of people.
That evening, Wallis prepared to take leave of her lover. The king reached across for one last touch of her hand. There were tears in his eyes, and his voice was shaking.
Wherever you reach tonight, no matter what time, telephone me. Bless you, my darling.
Parliament and country were divided over the crisis. Baldwin was told by his chief whip that at least 40 MPs were pro-king, cheering on Churchill in the House. There was a groundswell of public support. Baldwin was worried.
Situation here has become in many ways much more serious. A section of the popular press is also canvassing the idea of a morganatic marriage.
We still felt that love should overcome everything else. I don't think we would have wanted her as a queen, but as a morganic marriage, we would have been quite happy to accept it. If he loved that person, that was it.
My opinion of the king, he should marry who he loves. He's been a good chap to the working class. That's my opinion of him.
What are your views on this?
I think the king should marry the woman he loves. So the nation is behind him, and we must not lose him.
I reckon the king should please himself, who he marries, because he knows he's got everybody behind him.
There were large crowds outside Downing Street when we left, shouting, "We want King Edward! Down with the politicians!"
The world is now divided into cavaliers and roundheads, and the king's faction grows. People process the streets singing "God Save the King" and assemble outside Buckingham Palace. They parade all night. After the first shock, the country is now reacting and demands that their king be left in peace.
Wallis Simpson arrived at her hideaway in Cannes, where she was quickly discovered by the paparazzi. She was in constant touch with the king.
I am so anxious for you not to abdicate. Don't be silenced and leave under a cloud, I beseech you. There is no more to say except that I am holding you tighter than ever.
Despite Wallis's entreaties, the king, mindful of his constitutional position, had lost the will to fight. Over the weekend at the fort, he pondered his future.
In the end, the decision I reached was to put out of mind all thought of challenging the Prime Minister. A civil war is the worst of all wars. Its passions soar highest, its hatreds last longest, and a civil war is not less a war when it is fought in words and not blood.
On Monday, Winston Churchill in the House of Commons showed that Parliament had no taste for civil war either. Baldwin and the whips had strong-armed the Conservative Party into line.
Winston says, I am not afraid of this House. When I see my duty, I speak out clearly. Thus, when Baldwin sits down, Winston rises and is immediately greeted from all sides of the House with cries of no, no, and sit down.
He encountered disastrous opposition. He was jeered at, he was booed. He had met with more hostility than I think probably he ever had encountered in the House of Commons before, or still more afterwards. And it was, for him, a shattering experience.
He was quite astonished at the violence of the put-down he'd received in the House of Commons. But he was depressed after.
6 months after the abdication, Wallis and Edward, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, were married in France. Not one member of the royal family attended. Wallis was denied her legal right to be called Her Royal Highness. The former king was never allowed to return to live in the country where he had once reigned, or take up an official job, for fear that he and his wife might set up a rival court. George VI and his wife Elizabeth were crowned on the very day planned for his brother Edward's coronation. King George's premature death in 1952 was always blamed by the Queen Mother on the strain of kingship. She never forgave Edward and Wallis. The former king spent his days abroad golfing and consorting with celebrities. In many ways, deprived of a role, he became the empty man his enemies had predicted in a self-fulfilling prophecy. But he never regretted sacrificing all for love.
Sun, Sea and Sangria next tonight on BBC4 as we take a great British foreign holiday.